for joining us this evening for Basic Buddhist Teachings. And tonight, like a lot of nights, I'm going to talk a little bit about some history of Buddhism and about a particular monk named Drukpa Kunley. And he was a pretty outlandish teacher who lived around the time of the 16th century, early 16th century, and would have been a contemporary with the 8th Karmapa, Mikio Dorje, as well as the founder of the Drukpa lineage, Tsongkhapa. And I was really drawn in by his teachings despite the outlandishness of them. This book I was reading is called The Divine Madman, The Sublime Life and Songs of Drukpa Kunley by Keith Dowman, who was a well-known translator, particularly of the works of Longchenpa. And Drukpa Kunley is part of a lineage that most of us probably are not familiar with, which would be the Drukpa Kagyu lineage. And Tibetan Buddhism is full of lineages, just like Zen is and Theravadan Buddhism. But within the Kagyu lineage, which we're familiar with as received from Trungpa Rinpoche, the Takpo Kagyu lineage, Karma Kagyu lineage, is what's called the 4 greater and 8 lesser schools. So there's actually a bunch of subdivisions, and even within those lesser schools, there's even more subdivisions. And a lot of them really have to do with particular teachers that had a strong influence and maybe had a very particular style of teaching the Dharma. And so the Drukpa Kagyu lineage is one of the lesser schools of Buddhism, which is still alive in an unbroken lineage today. And it comes to us from one of Milarepa's most famous disciples, whose name was Rinpoche. We're often familiar with Gampopa, the student of Milarepa, who taught the first Karmapa. The 4 dharmas of Gampopa, which we recite, grant your blessing so that my mind may follow the Dharma, etc. Well, Rinpoche was the other main disciple of Milarepa. And if you ever get a chance to read Rinpoche's biography of Milarepa, translated by W.Y. Evans Wentz, it's wonderful, and it reads like a novel. It's very exciting. It's not like a traditional Tibetan biography. It's very exciting, very engaging. So this Drukpa Kagyu lineage is said to descend from Rinpoche, but through the form of a Tertan. And I know this gets complicated. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are individuals that are called Tertans who receive hidden teachings called Terma. And Terma can be either mind Terma or physical Terma. So physical Terma would be Rinpoche wrote a manuscript and hid it in a cave, or left a purba underneath a rock. And a future generation found those teachings, and so they were revealed physically. And then there's mind Terma, which is said to be something that's transmitted not in a physical form. So something like the sadhana of Mahamudra is considered mind Terma that Trungpa Rinpoche initially did not classify the sadhana of Mahamudra as mind Terma, and later on acknowledged that that was something he felt was received directly from Padmasambhava in Bhutan at the cave Padmasambhava went to retreat to. So the Drukpa Kagyu lineage is considered to be received as mind Terma from Rinpoche. It's a lie. But if I could simplify why Drukpa Kunley is a standout teacher, it is something that is a common thread I find throughout Buddhism that continues to inspire me, and I believe others, and that was his unwavering insistence on seeing the truth without bells and whistles. That he recognized the level of hypocrisy that can be bred through heavy institutionalization of Buddhism. And the reason this seems to happen is that we begin to become attached to our identity as Buddhists, as meditators, as chanters, as performers of ritual, those that don clothes. And while those things are necessary for the transmission of the teachings and can be fully in support of the vow, that on a mass scale, they often become appropriated. So people simply are perpetuating philosophy and ritual and tradition. And Drukpa Kunley, in order to point out this hypocrisy, was outlandish, completely outlandish. He went to a monastery and he thought, this is the story, that he would teach these monks how to laugh a little bit, have a good time. So he said, I'd like to come as a novice and to begin to work towards ordination. I said, okay, well, are you a good chanter? And he said, no, but I have a good friend who's a good chanter. We'll bring him tomorrow. And so the next day, he drags a donkey into the chanting hall. So this is my friend, and he proceeds to poke the donkey so it brays, and kick him out of the meditation hall. And time again, he has these outlandish gestures, particularly in large groups of monastics, where he was a spontaneous singer, and that's very common in Tibet. Milarepa was probably the most famous singer, the 100,000 songs of Milarepa. But recently, Khenpo Sultram Gyamso, who just passed, was also constantly singing realization, or the Reign of Wisdom, the collected songs of realization of the Kagyu masters. So it's a very rich tradition of these spontaneous songs of realization. And Drukpa Kunley was not. He was prolific in that regard. And so I wanted to give you a few small examples of his songs, which often start by venerating the beauty and the pristineness of the Buddha Dharma, and then by venerating gamblers, venerating prostitutes, and venerating vulgarity, and venerating laziness. And before I read the song, I think the reason he's become perhaps the most well-loved of the Buddhist saints, or the Buddhas, particularly in Bhutan. And I feel that it's because he represents the realization of us, of ordinary people that swear when they stub their toes and that have desires, and that he didn't represent that archetypical ascetic or strict disciplinarian. So he gave voice to the ordinary people that they could see the truth. And so he sometimes refers to himself as, and I probably am not pronouncing this correctly, but a Naljorpa, which simply means a yogi, or one who has magical powers sometimes, or just a wanderer. So he was not a monk. He did not receive or follow monk ordination. He had no monastery. He had no home. He said he was on eternal pilgrimage. So he says, I, a wandering Naljorpa, visited a Sakya academy, Sakya being one of the main branches of Tibetan Buddhism. And in that Gompas, or monastery, temple, place of solitude, the monks were splitting subtle doctrinal hairs. So fearful of forsaking the true path of Dharma, I kept to myself. I, a wandering Naljorpa, visited a Nyingma academy, which is one of the, I believe, the oldest form of Tibetan Buddhism. And in that Gompas, each monk was aspiring to mask dance. So fearful of becoming a professional dancer, I kept to myself. I, wandering Naljorpa, visited a pilgrim caravan and found the pilgrims engaged in trading. So fearful of becoming a profit-hungry trader, I kept to myself. I, wandering Naljorpa, visited a retreat center, and here the meditators basked in the sun. So fearing to relax in a small hut's security, I kept to myself. And he goes on and on, having met with the Kagyus and the Galdens and everybody. And each one he saw people that were deviating from what he saw was the essence of mind in favor of learning ritual, in favor of trading, in favor of prestige, in favor of position, acquiring. And his honesty about his crudeness is appreciated, that he actually embraces that aspect. And so in this song, he says, although I am unable to practice recitation and visualization, to the Buddha deity who grants realization and power, I vow to desist from cursing and malediction. Although I cannot rejoice in sacramental and symbolic offerings, the reality protectors who keep enemies at bay, I vow not to invite disaster upon my adversaries. Although I cannot meditate without fancy or bias, with a perspective that is always originally pure, I vow to desubstantiate concrete name and form. Although I cannot seal an inactive mind in an experience that is inexpressible and inconceivable, I vow never to put faith in my mind's conceptions. And so there's a relatability to Drukpa Kunley that's hard to find elsewhere, because he said, like, I can't have a mind of bliss and meditation, but I can do this anyway. I can't seal off my mind, but I can do this anyway. I can't rejoice in ritual and practice, but I can do this anyway. And so it's easy to get seduced into the outlandish stories of Drukpa Kunley and his misadventures, his bickering with the Karmapa or Tsongkhapa or other monks. But what I resonate heavily with is that in the midst of the forms that we participate in, to be reminded, which we are continuously through Sokuzan, we don't have to be somebody else. We don't have to take on the identity of a Buddhist or a meditator. We can just practice functioning in the midst of what arises immediately in the mind, in the senses, in the consciousness. And while I think he has a playful time undermining the institutions of Buddhism, he also showed great respect for Mikyo Dorje. He showed great respect because he recognized that while a lot of the institutionalization of Buddhism was breeding exclusivity, that it did not mean that one could not awaken in those situations. And that's what he would go into these monasteries, bringing the donkey into the chanting hall to point out how serious we take things. So if we were to translate that to our practice, which is what's important to me, if we can take Drukpa Kunley's life and stories and teachings and try to bring that into what we're doing here, I don't see it as being all that different from what we're already being taught. That in the midst of our intense negativity, we can practice, that we actually can awaken in the confusion, in the fighting, in the passion, in the aggression, in the ignorance. But there has to be some humor around it, and there is a lot of humor in this book, a lot. And that while we may need the forms that we have, practices and the rituals and the recitations, that it can always be a consideration of how can this be related to in a way to point back at my own mind. How can I recite Vasubandhu? How can I recite the Heart Sutra? How can I bow? How can I prostrate? How can I offer incense? Not so that I do it correctly, but as a reflection of my own mind. And I know we all kind of have our magnetism. For me, there's something about the gesture of bowing that I find I want to consider deeply. That it's not just a replication of tradition. It's not just an aesthetic gesture, but to actually consider what are you doing physically. You are actually making your body low. You're actually moving your body below everything else. And it's a gesture of a bodhisattva, that while we may not be able to understand what it means to embody the bodhisattva ideal, we can practice these gestures of acknowledgement, of appreciation, of respect. And years ago, when Sokuzan was transmitted, there was three things that stood out when Shoho came to visit. The first one was when he corrected everyone's posture in White Tara between ceremonies. The second was his teaching on be a good host. And the third one stood out for me, which was to try once a day to just make sure you're very intentional about your bowing, because it becomes such a habituated gesture. As we've talked about, I know I've left the Zendo and literally just throwing my hands over my shoulder, like, there you go, Buddha, this is what I have to say or what I think. It's not that that should never happen, but the awareness around it, that at one point during the day, you could actually stop and just bow. And so Drukpa Kunley does a lot of that, along with drinking a lot of Tibetan beer, cham, drink a lot of beer. So are there any questions that I might be able to respond to? So Kuzan.
So Drukpa Kunley, according to one of the stories, was he the one that, like you told me about it, he thrust his penis towards a demon and broke the teeth of the demon. So could you say what the import of such an outrageous story would have? What is your understanding of that?
I don't know that I can fully unpack what that means. Part of that shows up is just the raw vulgarity of it, that it is in such strong contrast to the way that the Buddha Dharma is so often presented, that even in the introduction by Keith Dowman, he encourages us to look at the reaction around hearing such outlandish stories. And one thing he said that was helpful was these are not stories that are intended to be laughed at, although they are so outrageous and they seem very funny, that something more profound is endeavoring to be indicated by these outrageous activities. And Drukpa Kunli's penis, phallus, is very famous. And if you look at imagery of Bhutan, it is very common for the houses to have penises painted on them or wooden penises carved outside. And that started with Drukpa Kunli. And Jishin recently recommended a movie, The Monk and the Gun, which was a beautiful Bhutanese film, just stunning. And I would recommend watching it, but at some point, part of the movie is this kind of neurotic gun collector from America has to throw this precious gun into a grave underneath a stupa. Otherwise, he's going to go to prison. And in exchange, the Lama gives him an enormous carved phallus. That was the exchange. So for me, something about the vulgarity and also being encouraged to look at the pre-programmed response to hearing something like that seemed helpful to me. Yes.
So how would you, I'm sure we can all do a little bit of this, but how would you contrast the right down here, if you go down the trail here, go towards the bridge, right? Just before the bridge, there are large penises drawn on the sidewalk. Have you seen those?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so what's the difference between that penis and the one in Nepal that's written on the side of the buildings?
In some sense, for a practitioner, there wouldn't be one. And the way that shows up for me is that just like these stories evoke a reaction to be observed, similarly to encounter it, anything that evokes reaction to me is to be looked at. Now, symbolically, they mean very different things. In one sense, it's intended to be a gesture of fertility and protection. And in another one, it's purely presented for vulgarity's sake. But I think that both of them call into question for me the reaction that arises around those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions, Jishin?
Jishin going. I'm wondering whether it is accessible for you to share from that book like a short example of that humor. If not, it's okay, but we've been talking about humor recently, and would be good to hear something about. Thanks.
I could say something about it, but I think maybe it was a misrepresentation to say humor. It's humor in the sense that it's so shocking, it's so startling, but it's not intended particularly. Well, some of it maybe is like the him bringing the donkey into the chanting hall. That's very funny. Imagine this sacred monastery. This monk says, "I've got a friend who's a good chanter," and he drags a donkey in. But he wasn't doing it just to be funny. It's not just stupid humor. It was intended to have some sort of shaking up of the artificial sacredness that was being maintained, to point out the ordinary sacredness of what was occurring. And he does a nice job poking fun at different religious figures, but in turn also showing a lot of respect. In one exchange, he's singing this song denigrating this poet. And the poet comes back and sings a song denigrating Drukpa Kunley. And then they both smile and appreciate one another. So it's like they're teasing one another, they're making fun of one another's lifestyle, but they both recognize that their realization is not monopolized through lifestyle. So there's stuff like that, or he comes to a feast and he's the Sakya Panchen, which would be like the head of the Sakya lineage of Tibet. He says the Sakya Panchen of To has needs the same as his servants, but the distribution of the meat is unfair. Some receive good meat and some receive bad. So there's a teaching, but then it gets a little bit outlandish. He says, all sheep, it is true, are mutton, but some are fat and some are thin. What were you doing, O sheep, when your friends were grazing and drinking? You only become fat by grazing. Now go back to the field and eat. And he hits the piece of meat and it becomes the sheep and it runs off. And I can give you one more because it's really quite outlandish. He is traveling and comes across a funeral, and he is asked to perform funeral rites. And so he does, and he drinks a tremendous amount of beer and gets very drunk. And they say, Drukpa Kunli, it would be so incredibly auspicious if you would carry this body up to the funeral pyre. And he's like, I am too drunk. I am not doing that. And they insist, and they say, this woman was such a devout follower of yours. So when I say this, I would just say, just look at what shows up, because that's, to me, the most important thing. So he starts to beat the dead body and yell at it and tells it to walk. And so the dead body gets up and walks up the funeral pyre and lights itself on fire. So it's a time where fantastic imagery was used to express the power of teachers, to emphasize aspects of the teaching, but imagery that is difficult to comprehend outside of a fantasy movie. So he had a lot of these interactions where, no, I'm too drunk to carry, or I don't want to. I'll get the dead body to move itself. And so that's why I'm saying it's easy to get seduced in these stories, because they are entertaining. This is not a dry read. There's nothing dry about it. But to try to reflect on it within the context of the essence of what is being conveyed, which is Drukpa Kunli's belief that all beings could awaken in the exact position that they were in. But because of our belief of who we are and what we're confined to, we limit ourselves in that sense. The best example I can think of is dreaming. If you've ever had a chance to have a lucid dream, it's incredible in the sense that you literally have no rules. There are no laws of physics. And yet our beliefs are so conditioned, we limit what we're able to do in a dream because of our beliefs about the physical world. And so I think he's similarly saying that we become so habituated to our position in society that we always think about the other position we should try to attain, the position of holiness or sacredness or wealth. And he's saying, I am a sexually active, beer drinking, person, and have liberated my mind in the midst of that. I can't do what Mikio Dorje has done. I can't sit like Tsongkhapa. I can't run a monastery like Panchen, Sakya Panchen, but I don't need to. So I really appreciate his calling out in that regard. And just one more line that really stood out to me. This is from one of his songs. What use is great talent and intelligence, unable to love all beings as your sons? Failing to realize that Buddha is within, what reality can be found outside? Like an ant climbing a sandhill accomplishes nothing. Gathering instruction, but ignoring meditation on the nature of mind. It is like starving oneself when the larder is full. Further questions?
Thank you. I just have one more, Jishin Bowing. Do you think that that those teachings can be a representation of crazy wisdom?
Yes. Yes, Drukpa Kunley is. It actually started when when Sogazan asked me to talk about crazy wisdom, and I was just reading about like Karma Pakshi, and Drukpa Kunley came up in that regard. And just that title, Divine Madman, and last week we were talking about divine ecstasy. I think another way of saying that.
If you could pretend that I were 5 and tell me, how do I look at that carving and relate to my own mind?
If you were 5, I'm just trying to imagine. So Rumi's 5, and what would he ask?
Yeah, I might not use the word relate.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Okay, when I look at that statue, how can I how should I think of myself? Trying.
Yeah. It's a difficult question because I would just be very tentative to give Rumi much of anything or any 5-year-old. So maybe if we take out the 5-year-old part, I don't know that it's necessarily appropriate to try to create that abstraction. It might be with the right 5-year-old, like Alaya might be ready for that at 5. I don't think Rumi is. Maybe. But I think that if we look at the image of the Buddha and we look at the historical context, which is to say that there is natural perfection, that you reflect on the idea that you are the Buddha, you are a complete being. There's nothing that needs to be done. You don't need to become something else. But even that doesn't feel like it really addresses your question.
Beyond bowing, I just was looking for like a practical and maybe short, succinct type of answer.
Be kind to yourself. I think that's something that people often don't feel that they can do on the spiritual path, is be kind to themselves. Because there's some sort of austerity that we have in mind around spirituality. And that's why a teaching like Drukpa Kunley's can be helpful if understood or looked at from the standpoint of practice or trying to understand our minds, is that Drukpa Kunley didn't withhold anything from himself, and yet he saw the trappings of the world. So he saw the trappings so he could participate in them. And another famous example would be Marpa, the translator. He lived a life where he had a house and he had some wealth and he had a wife and a son. And that did not forbid him from realization because he had some pleasant things. I think that's at least what I'm working on a little bit is if I can't be kind to myself, how am I going to be kind to you fundamentally? I can be patronizing, I can put on a front of kindness, but if there's not some basic understanding of what it means to be kind towards ourselves, it's probably going to be difficult to have any real kindness towards others. Yes.
Beyond bowing, I think it would be easy to make an argument for his gluttony.
Yes.
How could you make an argument in the opposite?
Well, I don't feel like I need to, and that's to me, some of the trappings is to think that this stops to becoming an archetype and starts becoming a demand, that we do not have to justify that activity, and that's why there's some sort of, what is the essence of what's being said? And to me, the essence of what is being said is to awaken in the midst of what is occurring, that you don't need to retreat to some sacred place. But I wouldn't validate the activities themselves because we don't understand the activities. We just see the relative exchange, beating a dead body and saying, walk up a hill. That doesn't work. You can't just imitate that. So that I'm very tentative with any teacher that has ever existed in the history of Buddhism to hold them up as an example of how to act. More of when they saw what was true for themselves, how did they continue to function? And some of them continued with austere lives, some of them were householders, some of them were ascetics, some of them were wanderers or famous abbots, abbesses. So we get to wake up for ourselves in our own way in the midst of our own karma.
Well, Divine, along those same lines, how do we recognize truth? How do we recognize the Dharma, the true Dharma?
If we recognize it as a form of discrimination, it's probably not the true Dharma. So if it is being registered by means of characteristics, being registered by means of activity or sense perception, we're still kind of dealing in samsara. And so I often like the way Sokuzan's related to like, what is it not? So it's not that it's not the characteristics, but it's not the characteristics as a separate situation. It's not like compassion because of softness, and yet softness could be an expression of compassion. So it's not, it can't be confined by the form, and yet it can manifest in a form. So to look at what boundaries we hold up when relating to the world, how do we discriminate and try to maintain that discrimination because we feel that it's valid? And I always come back to those Tang Dynasty teachers and Dongshan Lianji's teacher saying, not knowing is most intimate. And it takes, you could say, some type of benefit of the doubt or faith to have a willingness not to know and think of that as intimacy. So we could look at the certainty, we could look at when things start to constrict into knowledge or artificial confidence, but I don't know that we would be able to recognize the truth as a form of discrimination.
Divine, so here we have a teacher who was outrageous. And he's considered a great teacher. And yet, many of his actions I don't know if the words too are outrageous. how is that the truth? How do we say that person is living their karma? Or that is the truth, and another person who is doing the same thing.
You can't say that. And in a sense, it's a little bit presumptuous and disrespectful to think that we can. And I think one of the most disappointing things that we confront on the path, at least for me, is that we have to be the bodhisattvas. No one else has to be a bodhisattva. So the evaluation of what's occurring externally as some sort of indication of what we should do or how we should do it is a little bit sticky. It's kind of it can be a trap. So it's very difficult to have a type of respect that doesn't need validation. Like it's not respect because someone is valid in being respected or they are respectable. So we're stuck with all of our projections and all of our insecurities about finding some ground in the external world. So none of that is resolved, but we have the full responsibility of what is occurring. And I think about it in our little microcosm of Sokokoji, it's very difficult not to be seduced into that pettiness because we don't want to be an adult. I want to be a child. I want to be acknowledged. I want to be supported. I want to be told what's right and wrong so I don't disappoint. And you begin to see that even if nobody else ever takes responsibility for their actions, it has no bearing on your responsibility to receive. And I don't like that. So I would just be very tentative to look at Drukpa Kunley and try to understand why he was a Buddha. I wouldn't tell anybody that, but I come back to that essence of to look at how do we get seduced into our own hypocrisy on the path.
Shoro bowing. How or what is it to use a form as a reflection of our mind, and what is that in contrast to bowing?
Some idea of returning as opposed to maintaining. I think that's the way it's talked about most commonly here, that you return to those forms as opposed to maintaining them. When it becomes a maintenance, it's more along the lines of accomplishment. You don't have to look at it. So in any one of the forms, we're going to have some reactions, some larger and some smaller. And even if relatively those reactions are valid, we still have the confusion itself to look at. I think that book study for some can be a really antagonistic practice. It's very difficult to have to listen to other people's, what you perceive as confusion. But even if what they say is confusion, your irritation, your resistance, your anger is not clear because you still think it's valid to not attend or to fight with them or to correct. And so to use the forms for the benefit of others by reflecting on how it elicits our own positions.
Beyond bowing, I'm very curious about how you said he did not withhold from himself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, how does one participate and even follow forms regularly? Or just participate and follow forms with this idea of not withholding from ourselves?
The way it would show up for me is as in a subtle sense that every one of us has a different relationship to forms, and whatever that is to be included. So even cyclically, I imagine that a lot of us go through these times where it's really easy to practice and we feel very motivated and we show up like to everything. And then times where we don't show up to anything, or times where we force ourselves to show up to anything. And to not withhold from oneself would be to not feel like you have to maintain a particular attitude or a particular performance. And so you take your seat when you want to. You don't take your seat when you don't want to. You take your seat when you don't want to. You don't take your seat when you do want to. in a sense, it feels quite simplistic, and yet it feels completely impossible because the energy to fulfill those demands is overwhelming at times. And so I would say that our perseverance on the path, with at least the conceptual understanding that all the things your mind provides you, you can traverse the path with those things still arising. So I didn't mean it in the sense of like indulging, like he just completely was able to indulge in everything. It's those tendencies, those dispositions aren't obstacles on our path. And sometimes we have this mindset of just intense aggression around our spiritual path, where we feel like the only way we'll ever wake up is if we completely isolate ourselves from all temptation or set up a form that protects us so that we can see our mind more clearly, instead of seeing the mind can't be held at bay. One of my early experiences of this was just as a young man going through overwhelming depression, and I decided to canoe down the Mississippi River. And the whole inspiration for that trip was to be somebody different. And the disappointing thing was, like, day one, the same guy showed up that I thought was still in Michigan. So similarly, on our spiritual path, we can create circumstances that we think are going to be really special, and yet the same petty mind shows up. It's not to say we shouldn't set up those circumstances through retreat or through daily practice, but to look at the expectation that somehow by doing that, we will have the result of being this radically different and spiritual person.
Going in connection to Ondo's question about outrageous acts of the teacher, and finding the, I think she said, truth. I'm wondering whether those those outrageous acts are a part of karma, or are they reflecting something of that crazy teaching, crazy spontaneous teaching of the awakened teacher?
I don't know if I could delineate karma from the crazy wisdom expression of the teacher. I don't think that those could be delineated. Thank you. We'll stand and dedicate the merit.
Penetrate into all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha's way. Shi-o sang shi shi-fu, shi-son sa-mo-ko-sa, directions, the three times, all Buddhas, all venerable ones, Bodhisattvas, Mahasattvas, the great Prajna Paramita.
O Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions and the 3 times, please hear us. Please come down out of the light and protect Sokokoji Buddhist Temple Monastery, our Sangha, families, friends, and visitors. Heal everyone who is unhappy, sick, or suffering, and fill them with light.